No one expected that rainy Sunday to end in chaos. It was Michael's 20th birthday, and his mother's house was full of friends and family. Laughter, cold soda, chocolate cake, and soft country music played in the background. And in the midst of it all, she arrived, slowly, with a brown bag in her hand. Mrs. Margaret, his grandmother, with that serene smile that always hid something more. Michael didn't notice right away. He was absorbed in his friend's gifts, brand-name sneakers, expensive headphones, cards with money inside. But then someone pointed out, "Your grandma brought a gift." He turned, and there she was, standing, waiting only for a glance. What no one knew was that this simple package would change everyone's lives forever. Before I continue, I want to say that I ask God to bless you with all His infinite love, giving you much health, peace, joy, and faith, for we can never lose faith in God, for He will never abandon us, for His love is eternal and infinite. I also want to take this opportunity to ask that you like the video and subscribe to the channel. This helps me a lot, thank you. Now take a deep breath, because what comes next, you won't believe it. Michael smiled, a little embarrassed. He picked up the bag, feeling it was too light to contain anything important. "Thanks, Grandma," he said politely. His friends laughed, some even whispered. He opened it and took out an old notebook covered in flowery fabric, and a keychain with a small blue stone hanging from the ring. He barely managed to hide his expression of disdain. "Is that all?" someone said. Everyone laughed. Michael looked at his grandmother, trying not to appear ungrateful. She just smiled, as if she were keeping a secret no one else knows. "Read it when you're alone," she whispered, and walked away. That sentence echoed for longer than he'd imagined. But at that moment, all he wanted was to get back to the party. The notebook lay on the sofa. 4 hours, no one paid attention to it. Michael made jokes, played games, ate his second piece of cake, and even forgot about the gift. But his grandmother, sitting in the corner of the room, watched everything with the eyes of someone who had seen too much in this life. She knew. She knew something big was about to happen. What no one there knew was that Margaret had spent the night awake, silently praying for this moment. She hesitated several times before choosing what to give her grandson. She had little money, many memories, and a secret that had weighed heavily on her chest for decades. The notebook was the only remaining bridge between the past and the future. When the party ended, she left without fanfare. She climbed into the taxi with difficulty, adjusted her cane on the seat, and looked out the window one last time. Michael didn't even notice her leaving. He was too busy taking selfies with his friends. But the emptiness that remained in the air after her departure, no one could explain. Hours later, late at night, Michael saw the notebook on the living room floor. He picked it up out of curiosity, thinking about throwing it away. But then he remembered what his grandmother had said, "Read when you're alone." Something about that phrase made him hesitate. He went upstairs, turned on the lamp, and sat on the bed. Then, he opened the first page. There was a photo taped together with old duct tape. A black and white photo of a couple smiling in a wheat field. It was his grandmother and a man he didn't know. Below the image was a handwritten phrase, "To my love, with whom I shared a secret that would change everything." Michael frowned. Who was that man? The following pages were filled with letters, notes, dates, and short stories. All written by his grandmother, in a firm, emotional hand. He was talking about hard times, bad decisions, and a promise made in a hospital bed. Michael felt a lump in his throat. This wasn't just a gift, it was an invitation. An invitation to learn about a part of the family's history that had never been told. And perhaps, a plea for help. But the strangest part was yet to come. Inside the notebook, in the middle of the pages, was a small key, taped shut. No caption. Just a cross drawn next to it. He didn't know it, but that key would open much more than just a door. The next morning, a loud knock on the door startled everyone. It was too early for visitors. When Michael's mother opened the door, she saw 2 plainclothes police officers. One of them held a folder and asked directly, "We'd like to speak with Mrs. Margaret Thompson." The house froze, and Michael, from the top of the stairs, felt a shiver run down his spine. "She was here yesterday," the mother replied suspiciously. "Why?" The police officer hesitated. We have questions about a cold case over 40 years old, something related to a rural property in Nebraska. Michael ran downstairs. Nebraska? He asked, the notebook still in his hand. It was the place mentioned in one of the letters. The police officers entered and explained they had received an anonymous tip. A new lead on an old disappearance. We need to know where Mrs. Thompson is. She could be the key to solving something that's been unresolved for a long time. No one understood. But Michael was starting to connect the dots. He wasn't sure whether to tell her about the notebook. He was afraid of hurting his grandmother. But he also sensed something bigger was going on. Something that involved not just her, but her entire family. The police officer's words still echoed in his mind. Key piece. Disappearance. Rural property. And then he remembered the key inside the notebook. While his mother spoke to the agents, Michael ran to his room and pulled the key from the envelope hidden between the pages. You took in every detail. It was old, rust-marked. And it bore a small inscription, Hope. That couldn't be a coincidence. Your heart raced. What if it was, in fact, a literal key to the past? That night, he called his grandmother. He called several times, with no answer. Then he tried texting, but she didn't use a cell phone. He decided to drive to her house, 20 minutes away. When he got there, the door was unlocked. The lights were off. And the kettle was still warm on the stove. She had recently left. In the center of the table a note, Michael, if you've read this far, then you're ready. Follow the map in the yellow envelope. He swallowed hard. He looked around, as if expecting her to appear at any moment. But the house was completely silent. He picked up the envelope and opened it. Inside, an old, hand-drawn map, marking an abandoned barn in Nebraska. On the back of the map was a biblical quote, For there is nothing covered that will not be revealed, nor secret that will not be known. Luke 12 verse 2. Michael felt tears well up in his eyes. This wasn't just a mystery to be solved. It was a mission. Something God had prepared, through the hands of his own grandmother. He sat on her couch, still holding the notebook, the key, and the map. He remembered all the Christmases, the stories told on her lap, the smell of apple pie. And now, here he was, charged with unraveling a secret buried for decades. A secret that, apparently, involved crimes, promises, and perhaps even redemption. As he stared at the key in his hands, a certainty crept into his heart. He had to go. It wasn't about the present anymore. It was about the truth. And something inside him told him this would change his life forever. But what he didn't yet know was that the truth awaiting him in Nebraska was much deeper than he could have imagined. When Michael was little, the most constant figure in his life was his grandmother Margaret. While his parents were busy with jobs and commitments, she was the one who took him to school, made pancakes on cold mornings, and told stories by the fire. She said that every child needs roots before it can grow wings. And Michael, even without understanding, felt safe with her. As if the outside world couldn't reach him. He spent entire summers in his grandmother's wooden house, surrounded by tall trees and an old swing hanging out front. It was a simple but enchanting place, at least to a child's eyes. There were scents he never forgot, cinnamon, homemade soap, and his grandmother's gentle perfume. She taught him to pray before bed, saying that God heard even the smallest thoughts. And Michael believed with all his heart. Margaret told Bible stories with her own unique style. She dramatized, used voices, and etched each lesson into the boy's soul. He knew David's name before he learned his own. Noah's Ark was one of his favorites because his grandmother always said, even in the greatest storm, God never forgets those he loves. This would become a truth he would only truly understand many years later. From her, Michael learned that faith wasn't a religion, it was a way of seeing the world. That prayer was stronger than any scream. And that sometimes, God's silence was just a not yet. Margaret never forced her belief, but she lived with such conviction that it was impossible not to feel something different around her. There was peace wherever she was. In the late afternoons, they would play dominoes on the porch. And when he won, she would do a funny little dance, pretending to be angry. "This boy is going to bankrupt me with all the winning," she would say, laughing. Michael laughed so hard he forgot any sadness. Those moments were simple, but they had something sacred, as if time had stopped for a moment just for them. He remembered falling off his bike and scraping his knee. His grandmother picked him up, even though it was difficult, and sang softly until he stopped crying. She always said, "The pain goes away faster when someone cares." And with her, the pain truly did. It was as if his heart knew it was safe. Margaret didn't have many possessions, but she had something rare: time and attention. She listened to him with her eyes, with her whole body. When he spoke, she stopped everything. This taught Michael, even without words, the value of being present. Today, he understood how precious that was. And he was beginning to miss that kind of presence. On Sundays, they went together to the small-town church. They always sat in the fourth row, near the window. Margaret carried an old Bible, with colored pencil markings and small dried flowers between the pages. It was there that she recited verses from memory and wept silently during the hymns. Michael didn't know why she cried, but he sensed they were sacred tears. Once, after church, she said, "We don't have to understand everything to trust." That resonated with him for days. And somehow, that phrase would guide him through times far more difficult than he could have imagined. Margaret was silently planting seeds. Seeds that would germinate in Michael's heart years later, amid a storm of truth. At school, Michael always excelled in reading and writing. He blamed it on his grandmother, who made him read verses aloud before bed. Teachers praised his politeness and kindness. What no one saw was the source of it all. Margaret, with her quiet wisdom, had shaped the boy with deep values. She also taught him to forgive. When a friend betrayed him as a child, Margaret didn't tell him to forget. She told him to understand. Everyone carries hidden pain. Sometimes they hurt others to try to heal their own wounds. Michael didn't understand right away, but that phrase resonated with him when he had to deal with difficult truths about his own family. During adolescence, visits to her grandmother's house became more rare. The hustle and bustle of life, commitments, friendships, everything began to distance that connection. But Margaret never demanded it. When he did show up, there was still warm cake and a wide smile. She didn't ask for constant presence, just genuine presence. And that was what hurt Michael most now. The realization that perhaps he'd drifted too far away. That the years she needed him most, he'd been too busy trying to grow up. That ridiculous gift, that flowery notebook, was a bridge back. A silent attempt at reconnection. And now, he needed to cross over. Each memory came back more powerfully as he reread the notebook. The words written there seemed to have been saved for that very moment. It was as if Margaret knew the exact day her grandson would need to rediscover his roots. And perhaps she also knew that his faith would need a good dose of remembrance. The most curious thing was how she could write in such detail about such profound feelings. It seemed as if each page had been written on her knees, in prayer. Michael wondered how many nights she spent alone, talking to God about him. And now, those words became a compass for the path ahead. In one of her letters, she wrote, "If you ever get lost, remember where you came from. The right path isn't always the easiest, but it's always the safest when God guides your steps." Michael felt a tightness in his chest. He was, indeed, lost. And perhaps it was time to return, not just physically, but spiritually as well. The photos he found in the notebook depicted moments he no longer remembered. A snowy Christmas, with him still rosy-cheeked and wearing blue pajamas. His grandmother beside him, holding his hand. Another portrait showed the two of them lying on the living room floor, laughing with a game board between them. Small fragments of a childhood that now seemed as distant as it was sacred. He noticed how Margaret lovingly documented everything. It wasn't just a gift, it was a memorial. A paper altar built with memories, faith, and silence. She didn't just want to be remembered. She wanted him to know where he came from. And maybe, where he should go. Because there was something in that past that still needed to be resolved. Every word seemed chosen with divine intention. As if she knew the notebook would be read at a precise moment, when everything else was about to fall apart. Michael no longer saw it as a ridiculous gift. It was now the only thing that made sense amid so many doubts. And the call with the police only reinforced this. Further into the notebook, he found a page with just one question: "Do you still believe in miracles?" Michael paused. He'd never given it much thought. but something inside him wanted to say, yes. As if his grandmother's faith had taken root even in corners where he thought it was dry. He remembered the prayer she prayed every night beside him. Lord, guard my boy's heart. May he never forget who he is, and whose you are. Perhaps it was that prayer that had kept him going this far. Perhaps the strength he needed now wasn't in the answers, but in his grandmother's simple faith. Michael knew he was about to embark on a difficult journey, that he would discover things that could forever change his image of his own family. But now, at least, he had something to hold on to, the living memory of a love that had always protected him, and perhaps still was. He closed the notebook carefully, as if guarding a relic. He took a deep breath, and right there, in the silence of the room, he said his first prayer in many years. God, I don't know what's coming, but if Mrs. Margaret trusts in you, then I want to trust too. And he felt something inside him ignite, like a small flame, reborn. Margaret's house was on the last street of a quiet neighborhood, where neighbors still left their doors unlocked. After her husband left, she never slept in the master bedroom again. She settled on the sofa, as if trying to fill the space left by his absence. The walls held more silence than conversation. But she never complained. Widowed at 58, Margaret reinvented herself. She learned to live on a shoestring, to repair the backyard fence herself, to change light bulbs, and to push the lawnmower with tired hands. But there was one thing she could never replace: the sound of his voice calling to her in the kitchen. It was there that loneliness screamed loudest. She woke up early every day, even when there was no one to serve coffee. She maintained her routine out of respect for her own sanity. She read the Bible before sunrise and wrote in a small brown notebook where she jotted down prayers and names. Almost every day, the name Michael appeared. It was her way of caring for him, even from a distance. Margaret began crocheting to sell at the church fair. Her dishcloths with embroidered flowers were popular among the local women. It didn't bring in much money, but she said it occupied her hands and warmed her soul. And when sales were good, she would buy sweets to take to Michael, even if he didn't ask. Sundays were the hardest days. The empty pew next to her at church seemed to mock her longing. Sometimes tears would flow as the choir sang. But no one asked, because everyone already knew. Her husband's absence was an open wound, but also a vivid reminder of a love that was real, deep, and eternal. One afternoon, she sat alone in the garden and reread an old letter from her husband, written in the 1970s. The words still smelled of youth and hope. If one day I'm no longer here, remember that you were my miracle. She tucked the letter away in a blue envelope, inside the notebook she would later give to Michael. What no one knew was that Margaret also carried a silent burden. Something he'd never told anyone. A secret she'd sworn to keep for the rest of her life. But now, as she grew older, she felt the need to put it in writing. Not to clear her conscience, but so that the truth could finally be named. The room that had once been the couple's now held boxes of mementos. Photographs, old newspapers, dusty documents. One, in particular, was wrapped with a red bow. A contract for the sale of a rural property in Nebraska. Something Margaret had avoided looking at for decades, but now kept her up at night. She knew the time was coming. Her health wasn't what it used to be. Her memory was starting to play hide and seek. So writing in the notebook was her way of leaving a trail. A path Michael could follow. Even if he laughed at first, she had faith that one day he would understand. Neighbors called her the Lady of Unshakable Faith. She was the first to arrive at services and the last to leave. Always with kind words, short prayers, and eyes that saw beyond appearances. But no one imagined that behind that smile lay sleepless nights, torn letters, and decisions that changed destinies. When asked if she ever felt lonely, Margaret would respond with a mysterious smile. Alone? Never. God and I always have tea together at 5. And it was true. Every afternoon, she would place 2 cups on the table, one for herself and one for God. A delicate way of saying, I'm still here. I still believe. The old radio in the kitchen was her favorite companion. It played old hymns that she hummed softly while baking bread or watering the plants. One in particular made her stop and close her eyes. Great is thy faithfulness. The song spoke of promises that never fail. and she clung to it like someone holding onto a branch during a storm. It was during one of these lonely afternoons that she made the decision to hand over the notebook. She knew Michael might not understand right away, but she also knew the seed planted in his heart still existed. It just needed a touch of faith to sprout, and time was running out to make that happen. She began writing everything down. The good stories and the difficult ones. The parts that hurt and the parts that healed. She didn't want to be remembered as perfect, but as someone real. Someone who loved, who made mistakes, who fell, but who always got back up with God's help. Because in the end, that's what matters. Not how many times we fall, but how many times we get back up. On one of the coldest nights of the year, she dreamed of her husband. He was smiling, standing on the porch of their Nebraska home. He waved, as if waiting for something important. Margaret woke with her heart racing. She felt it was more than a dream. It was a calling. Something was pulling her back to that place. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. Michael's birthday was just a few weeks away. It was the perfect time. She would write it all down, put the key in, and hand-deliver it. And let God take care of the rest. Because, deep down, she knew, the truth, however painful, was an act of love. In the days that followed, she lived as if saying goodbye slowly. She watered her plants more carefully. She read her favorite psalms more intensely. She wrote short letters to her neighbors, as if giving thanks for a life well lived. And when she finished the notebook, she cried. She cried as if a weight had finally been lifted from her shoulders. The gift was lovingly wrapped. It was a flowery fabric, just like the curtains in the house where she and her husband lived when they were young. It was tied with a blue ribbon, the kind you only find in antique shops. She knew Michael would find it strange. But the package held a story. A story he needed to know. On her birthday, she chose her best outfit, the navy blue dress, the faux pearl necklace, and the light pink lipstick. She walked slowly to her daughter's house, holding the gift in both hands. Along the way, she prayed, "Lord, may this be the beginning of a new era. May the truth free, heal, and unite." At the party, few noticed her. After all, it was Michael's day, not hers. But she observed everything tenderly. Every laugh, every hug, every gesture. She missed the time when he was just a boy with dirty feet running around her kitchen. But now, he was a man. And he had to face what was coming as such. When she handed him the gift, she saw the same expression in his eyes she'd seen when he'd received socks for Christmas. A mix of politeness and disappointment. But she wasn't shaken. She knew that sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as simplicity, and that only those who look with their hearts can see what truly matters. She didn't wait for thanks. She kissed her grandson on the forehead, sat for a few minutes, and, as if fulfilling a mission, left. No one noticed, but there was a relief in her shoulders. A kind of peace that only comes when we do what God asks of us, even if the world doesn't understand. When she got home, she made her afternoon tea. He poured 2 cups, as always. And this time, she smiled differently, as if she already knew the answer was coming. And what she didn't know is that the next day, the knock on Michael's door would bring not just questions, but a storm of revelations. Michael left the gift on his desk, dismissing it. He still felt bad for having found the simplicity of the gesture amusing, but he couldn't understand why it moved him so much. The notebook seemed harmless, bound in floral fabric, hand-stitched. However, something about the side seam was slightly uneven. A small bulge in the corner caught his eye. Carefully, he ran his fingers over the notebook's spine. He felt a difference in the texture, as if something were hidden inside. He picked up a utility knife, hesitated for a second, and then delicately cut the seam. An envelope emerged from within the cover. It was small, yellowed with age, and bore only one word, "Confidential." Heart racing, he opened the envelope. Inside were 3 items, an antique bronze key, a photograph folded in half, and a handwritten letter. He opened the photo first. It showed 2 men standing next to an old car in front of a barn. One of them was his grandfather, a young man, smiling. The other, Michael didn't recognize. But there was something strange about that smile. The letter began with a direct warning, "If you're reading this, it's because the time has come." Margaret recounted an episode from her youth that she had never told anyone. An accident, an escape, a secret that she and her husband had buried, literally. The barn in the photo wasn't just an old property. It was the place where it all happened. Michael reread the letter 3 times, silently. He discovered that during the 1970s, his grandfather had been involved in shady dealings, smuggling stolen auto parts. One day, something went wrong. A man disappeared. And to protect the family, Margaret helped her husband hide the truth. They left everything behind and started over. The notebook was actually a diary with organized accounts. Not just memories, but every detail of the lives they had hidden. There were notes with dates, names, and places. Everything written with almost surgical precision. Michael was shocked. His grandmother, that sweet and compassionate woman, had been keeping a criminal secret for over 4 decades. Later, Margaret explained that for years, she lived in fear that the truth would come out. That at any moment someone would knock on the door. But as time passed, she realized that the real burden wasn't the fear of justice, but the silence. The silence was what ate her up inside. And so, she decided to tell her grandson everything. The key, she revealed, opened a small metal box buried behind the barn in Nebraska. Inside was her husband's written confession and the rest of the evidence, documents, receipts, even a ring that belonged to the missing man. Margaret believed justice needed to be served, even if it was late. Michael felt torn. Part of him wanted to forget it all, to throw the notebook in the back of the drawer and pretend nothing had changed. But another part, the part his grandmother had shaped with Bible stories and nightly prayers, said he needed to do the right thing. "And you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," she had written on one of the pages. The dilemma now was a moral one. Denounce his own family? Go to Nebraska and open an old wound? Or protect the past and move forward? Margaret didn't ask him to make any decisions. She simply handed him the truth. And she trusted God to guide him. It was a choice, and also a test of character. Michael stayed awake all night, reading each page carefully. He discovered that his grandfather had stopped participating in illegal activities years before his death. But he never had the courage to turn himself in. Margaret, out of love and fear, covered it all up. And time, which was supposed to heal, only made everything harder to bear. At the back of the notebook was a handwritten prayer. "Lord, may the truth not destroy my grandson, but strengthen him. May he know that we are not defined by our mistakes, but by how we choose to face them. Give him courage, wisdom, and faith. And forgive me for waiting so long." It broke Michael inside. He wept for his grandmother, for the loneliness she endured, for the burden she bore alone, and for having been so blind as to find her gift ridiculous. Now, that notebook was all he had of her. It was a spiritual inheritance, a confession, a legacy. And he knew he couldn't ignore it. The next step was to follow the map. But before that, he needed to better understand who the man in the photo was. He took the image to a friend who worked in editing. They were able to scan and enlarge the details. The man next to his grandfather wore a pin on his shirt pocket, a police badge. That changed everything. He wasn't just a civilian. He was a police officer. Michael swallowed hard. What if the disappearance had been more serious than he imagined? Margaret didn't elaborate on what happened that night. He simply said that the mistake had forced them to flee. But now, with this new information, the weight was even greater. What exactly was buried behind that barn? He decided to call the local police station in the town where his grandfather lived. He didn't mention the name, just described the photo. The operator hesitated after hearing the details and said she would call back. 15 minutes later, 2 investigators called back. And then came the sentence that made Michael freeze. "This photo is part of a missing persons cold case." "How did you get it?" Michael hung up without answering. He was panicking. Now he knew he wasn't just dealing with family secrets, but with a real investigation. What would he do with this? He returned to the notebook, as if seeking guidance. And then he noticed that, beneath the back cover, there was another envelope hidden. This new envelope contained an unofficial will. Margaret declared that she was leaving all decisions in Michael's hands. She no longer sought to hide anything, only to offer the truth. and she lovingly asked him to consider what Jesus would do in that situation. "Choose truth. But also choose love," she wrote. It was that sentence that made his decision. He needed to go to Nebraska. Alone. Without telling his mother, without involving the police yet. He needed to see for himself. Understand what had really happened. The notebook was an emotional map. But the land, that abandoned barn, was the final stage of this story. Michael bought a flight for 2 days away. He packed a backpack with a few clothes, his notebook, his key, and a Bible he'd found among his grandmother's old books. He wasn't religious, but he felt he needed that company. For the first time in his life, he was about to make a decision that wasn't about him, but about his family's legacy. He didn't know if he would return different, or even if he could return the same. But the weight of the truth was now his. And his grandmother's faith. It was the only compass he had. What he hadn't yet imagined was that, upon arriving in Nebraska, he would discover that someone else was waiting for him. Someone who knew everything, and who didn't want him to open that box. The phone rang early that morning. Michael was still in his pajamas, packing his backpack for the trip to Nebraska, when his mother answered downstairs. Her tone of voice instantly changed. "Yes. He's here, I can call him." When she hung up, she went upstairs, her face pale. "It was the police. They want to talk to you." Michael froze. For a moment, he thought they'd discovered something he couldn't quite explain. He went downstairs, heart pounding, picked up the living room landline, and answered. "Mr. Thompson, we're from the Lancaster County Sheriff's Office, Nebraska. We received an anonymous letter mentioning your name and a possible lead on a cold case." It was as if everything was happening too fast. He merely confirmed that he was familiar with the property mentioned in the letter, the old barn, and that he intended to visit soon. But he didn't mention the notebook, or the key, or the photo. He remained calm. However, on the other end of the line, his tone was firm. "We need to meet him in person. As soon as possible." The call ended with an appointment scheduled for 2 days later at the small town's central police station. Michael couldn't understand how the police had called at that exact moment. And who had sent his name? Only he, his mother, and his grandmother knew what was going on. Unless someone else had been reading the notebook before him. That night, he barely slept. His mind was spinning in circles. What if someone was watching his steps? Someone interested in preventing him from getting to the truth? He began to pay closer attention to the things around him. A car parked across the street. A strange profile that had liked his old photos on social media. Small signs that now seemed like screams. The next day, she decided to visit her grandmother's house again. "I wanted to see the rooms with fresh eyes, looking for clues I might have overlooked." Upon entering, she smelled the familiar scent of coconut soap and chamomile tea. It was as if she were still there. In the hallway, she found a slightly ajar window. The same one that always remained locked. Something was wrong. He searched the house. Nothing seemed stolen, but there were subtle signs that someone had been there. A crooked painting. A misplaced book. And in his grandmother's room, a drawer was ajar. Inside was a single page torn from her notebook. It was a Bible verse, "Those who practice evil hate the light." John 3 verse 20. Michael sat up in bed, the page in his hands. Was this a warning? Or a plea for protection? He didn't know who to trust anymore. But one thing was certain, the story was getting bigger than him. It wasn't just about his grandmother anymore. It was about people who didn't want their past to come to light. That same afternoon, an envelope was left on his mother's doorstep. No return address. Inside, an enlarged photo, the same image of his grandfather with the unknown man. Only now, with a red X drawn over the police officer's face. And a handwritten note, "Some things belong buried." Michael felt his legs tremble. Who knew this photo existed? He didn't post it anywhere. He had the only copy with him. And the original, in his grandmother's notebook. Had someone actually broken into the house and accessed the documents? From that moment on, he realized his search for the truth might not only be emotional, but also dangerous. He decided he couldn't go alone anymore. He sought out a childhood friend, Lucas, who served in the Army Reserves and lived nearby. He told him part of the story, just enough to convince him to come with him to Nebraska. "It'll be a quick trip. I need to confirm something on my family's property," he said. Lucas agreed without further question. The journey began the next day. Hundreds of miles of empty roads, surrounded by yellow fields and long silences. Michael carried the notebook on his lap, rereading passages more carefully. This time, he found something he hadn't noticed before, a mention of the word vault hidden in the barn's wooden floor. And a date, September 1974. He wrote it down. It was the same year as the letter found in the secret envelope. A pattern began to emerge. With each page, the story became more connected. The image of his grandfather was no longer idealized. But at the same time, his respect for Margaret grew. How had she managed to maintain all this alone? For so long? When they arrived in town, they went straight to the nearest hotel. The police station was 3 blocks away. But Michael knew he had to go to the barn first. It was the only way to understand why the police were so interested in the case now, and what exactly they were hoping to find, before he saw it with his own eyes. The next morning, with the key in their pocket and the map in hand, he and Lucas drove to the property. It was a large, isolated lot, with tall weeds and broken fences. The barn was still standing, but battered by time. As they approached, a smell of old wood and wet earth filled the air. The past was alive there. Michael took a deep breath and entered. The floor creaked with every step. The windows were dirty, covered by years of dust and neglect. But deep inside the barn, behind a pile of planks, he found exactly what the letter had described, a small cross carved into the wood. He knelt, carefully removed the planks, and saw the metal lid. It was a box. Rusty, fastened to the floor with 2 old screws. He used pliers to loosen them, with Lucas's help. The box opened with difficulty. Inside were documents, letters, photos, and a small, rusty gun, all wrapped in a cloth stained with age. But what caught his attention was something else. A police badge, with the name John E. Walker. Michael recognized him from the photo. It was the missing man. What his grandmother didn't tell him was that his body had never been found, and that he might be there, buried on the property. He looked at Lucas, shocked, and before they could say anything, they heard a noise. A car was approaching, slowly. They ran to the barn window and saw a black pickup truck parked across the road. A man got out. He wore a hat and sunglasses. He stood there for a few minutes, staring straight at the barn. Then he got back in his car and drove away. But Michael knew he was being followed. The return to the city was silent. Michael felt he was in the middle of something much bigger than he'd expected. When he arrived at the hotel, he found a note under the door. "Don't go to the police station. They know." There was no signature. Just a curt, direct warning. Now he had to decide, leave or stay. Michael didn't sleep that night. The anonymous note seemed to pulse in his mind like a silent alarm. They know. But who were they? Them. The police. Or another force, less visible but more dangerous. He stared at the open box, still in the hotel room, fearful of what he was about to face. The name, John E. Walker, engraved on the box's badge, echoed like a ghost. It was official. His grandfather had been involved in the disappearance of a police officer. Margaret hadn't revealed everything. Maybe to protect him. Maybe because the pain of saying it out loud was unbearable. But her silence was now a weight he had to bear. At the bottom of the box, hidden beneath the papers, was an old cassette tape. And next to it, a handwritten note. "If you're listening to this, it's too late to turn back." The voice at the beginning of the recording was his grandfather's. Rusty, slow, as if each word weighed a ton. Michael pressed play. And the world, right there, turned upside down. "I never wanted to involve you in this, Margaret. But after what happened that night, I knew only you could help me." The recording continued with details. Officer Walker had uncovered the parts theft scheme, but wanted money to keep quiet. A deal was struck, but Walker threatened to report them anyway. Michael stopped recording. He was breathing heavily. Walker wasn't an innocent victim. He was a corrupt cop trying to take advantage of a criminal situation. That changed everything. But not enough to justify what happened next. In the recording, his grandfather confessed that there had been a fight. That Walker pulled the gun. And that he reacted first. The tape continued with muffled sounds, sobs, long pauses. Then, silence. Margaret entered the recording. Her voice was calm but shaky. "Let's do this together. If no one finds out, we can have a new life." The decision to hide the body, to run away, to change their names, was theirs. A pact of love, fear, and survival. Michael turned off the tape. He wept silently. He didn't know if he felt anger, sadness, or compassion. All at once. The image of his grandmother in church, praying on her knees, now mingled with that of a frightened young woman digging in the earth beside her husband on a moonless night. The truth was much heavier than he could have imagined. The next day, he returned to the barn. He had a shovel in the trunk. He needed to know if the body was still there. Where the box had been found, there was a patch of ground with soft earth, unlike the rest. He dug for hours. And when he finally found fragments of tissue, he stopped. That was enough. He didn't need to see any more. He called Lucas and they returned to the hotel. The penny was beginning to sink in. He wasn't just faced with an old story. He was faced with a crime buried by faith, love, and guilt. The most surprising thing was how Margaret had borne this weight, and yet managed to teach about God, kindness, and compassion without wavering. He decided it was time to tell his mother everything. He video-called her and calmly told her. She cried. She confirmed that she suspected something, but never had the courage to ask. Mom carried a lot of pain in her eyes, and always said that some truths only God could carry. Now, that burden was in Michael's hands. He called the police. He scheduled a new meeting, this time with another detective, someone from outside the county. He handed over everything, the recording, the documents, the location of the body. He said he wasn't seeking punitive justice, but restorative justice. And he asked, above all, that his grandmother's memory be respected. She had repented. Deeply. The police chief listened in silence. He said he would open an investigation, but that the advanced age and death of the main suspect changed the tone of the investigation. Margaret would not be tried. But the case needed to be officially closed. Michael asked that the conclusion be reached with dignity. Without scandal. Without headlines. Back at the hotel, he sat on the bed with a notebook in his lap. He felt as if he had walked through a desert and finally reached the limit. But there was still more. On the back of the last page, something was written in gold pen. Redemption does not erase the past, but it allows the past to be used to heal others. He understood that the mission didn't end there. Margaret had told everything not only for personal liberation, but so her grandson would know that even the greatest mistakes can be transformed by God. That darkness doesn't have to be the end. That sincere repentance is still a path. A narrow path, but redemptive. The next day, as he was packing his bags to return, he received a text message on his cell phone. It was from an unknown number. Just one sentence. "You were brave. But courage attracts eyes that prefer lies." Michael froze. Someone was still watching. Someone who might have been involved in this scheme, and was still nearby. He showed the message to the detective, who instructed him to keep everything confidential until the investigation was complete, and that if anything strange happened, he should disappear for a few days. Michael got the message. He would return home, but carefully. No posts, no public outings. For now, silence would be protection. Leaving Nebraska, he stared out the car window as the barn disappeared in the rearview mirror. It was like burying not only a body, but also a piece of his own innocence. He now saw the world through different eyes. And he understood that not every mistake is born of evil. Sometimes it's born of fear, of pressure, of a desperate attempt to protect the one you love. But that doesn't change the impact. Choices have consequences. And Margaret knew this. That's why she chose the truth, even in the end. She didn't try to hide it. She simply waited for the right moment. The moment when her grandson would have the maturity to understand. And enough faith not to judge, but to forgive. His name was George Thompson. To Michael, He was always just Grandpa George, the man with the silly jokes and the smell of aftershave. He remembered his big hands, his off-key whistle, and how he'd hug him tightly at Christmas. But now, George was also the center of a dark secret. And everything was about to change. Upon returning home, Michael decided to delve deeper into his grandfather's life. He combed through old albums, newspaper clippings, and, most importantly, conversations with neighbors and longtime family friends. What began as curiosity turned to amazement. George wasn't just an ordinary mechanic. During the 1970s, he was quietly investigated for involvement in receiving stolen goods. An older neighbor named Harold shared something no one else had ever told him. George was a good man, but he ran with the wrong crowd. He had a time when the police were watching him, but they never got anything concrete. Michael was in shock. His grandfather's image as a childhood hero began to crack. Margaret always protected her husband's memory. She never spoke of his mistakes. He always referred to him as a man of character. And perhaps he was. But that didn't erase the fact that, out of fear or desperation, he crossed dangerous lines. Lines that led to irreversible consequences, like the death of a police officer and decades of silence. Among the letters hidden in the notebook, there was one in particular. Addressed to George, but never sent. Margaret wrote, "You always wanted to protect us, even if it cost you your soul. I watched you waste away in silence. But God sees beyond the mistake. He saw your pain. And one day, maybe Michael will too." Michael reread this letter several times. For the first time, he tried to see his grandfather as a man, flawed, pressured, trying to hold his family together. He imagined what it would be like to be in his shoes, with debts, threats, a family to feed, and a choice between what's right and what's necessary. The reality was grayer than he wanted to accept. George died of a heart attack at 63, sitting in the rocking chair in the backyard. Michael was only 12 at the time. He remembered the wake, his grandmother's tears, and the silence that filled the house for weeks. But now, everything made more sense. That sudden death had perhaps been liberation. Among the documents in the box was also a torn-up contract. It was an attempted sale of a mechanic's shop registered in George's name. But the buyer was John Walker himself. A secret agreement to cover up some of the illegal activities. This proved that the two had a much closer and much dirtier relationship than anyone imagined. Michael took this document to the police station. The new detective looked at it carefully and simply said, "This changes the nature of the case. We're dealing with a long-standing corruption network that may still have active connections." Suddenly, George was no longer just an isolated piece. He was part of an even larger puzzle. The guilt now weighed even more heavily on Michael. It was as if every good childhood memory had been tainted by a shadow. But he remembered what Margaret wrote, "Repentance is the beginning of healing." And with that, he decided to look at his grandfather with mercy, not judgment. Because everyone makes mistakes. But few have the chance to make amends. Among the old papers in the basement, he found a short diary, written by George in the last months of his life. There, in a few pages, he confessed he was tired of hiding. "I wanted to tell the truth. But I couldn't. I preferred to die with her. But she didn't die with me. She will come out. And maybe that's what will finally set us free." That passage echoed in Michael's mind for days. George already knew. He knew Margaret would tell him one day. And perhaps that's why he lived his last years more silent, more distant. It wasn't coldness. It was shame. It was the silence of someone who loved so much, who preferred to fade away rather than drag his family into the hole. Deep down, Michael felt sorry. Not for the situation, but for the invisible prison his grandfather lived in. A cell without bars, built of guilt and secrets. The joyful man he knew was also a broken man inside. And that was perhaps the saddest thing of all. The pain he could never ask to be healed. At the next morning service, Michael went to the church where Margaret used to attend. He sat in the same fourth row. He smelled the scent of the wooden pews, heard the old hymns, and cried. He cried like he'd never cried before. Because now he understood. He understood the cost of keeping faith alive even with the past screaming at him every day. The pastor, unaware of anything, preached on forgiveness that day. Who are we to deny forgiveness, if Christ himself forgave us first? It was as if that message had been written just for him. Michael felt something shift inside. Some of the anger melted away, and compassion began to take its place. He decided to visit his grandfather's grave. He brought simple flowers and his grandmother's notebook. He sat beside the headstone and began reading aloud. "Your grandson is here, George. I found out everything, and I won't run from it." He read every letter, every word, and in the end, he left his grandfather's diary there, buried next to the memory that could now rest. Before leaving, he looked to the sky and prayed, "Lord, I don't know what Grandpa went through, but I know you know every heart. If he repented, then receive his soul, and help me move forward with dignity, not to erase the past, but to transform the future." It was the most sincere prayer of his life. On the way back, she felt something she hadn't felt in days: lightness. Not because the pain disappeared, but because understanding replaced judgment. Understanding doesn't mean justifying. It means choosing to see beyond the error. Margaret knew this, and perhaps all she wanted was for her grandson to see it too. Michael returned home with a restless soul. The journey had revealed more than he was prepared to know. But it also brought something I hadn't expected: a new sense of purpose. He was no longer just Margaret and George's grandson. Now he bore the responsibility of deciding what to do with all he knew. The truth was in his hands, literally and spiritually. He could hand it over to the press, let the story explode publicly, or shield it, as his grandmother had done for decades. But there was a third option, harder, more painful, and infinitely more powerful: using that story to heal, to redeem, to transform. Sitting in his room, notebook on his lap, Michael remembered a conversation with his grandmother when he was still a child. He had asked her why some bad things happened to good people, and she replied, "Sometimes God allows us to break, to show us how good He is at rebuilding." That made more sense now than ever. He decided to rewrite the family story, truthfully, but also with compassion. He wanted to tell everything, yes, but not to scandalize. He wanted to show the human side, to show that even people of faith, loving and well-intentioned, can make terrible mistakes, and that even so, there is room for forgiveness and reconciliation. He started an anonymous blog. He told the story in parts, as if it were fiction. Based on true events, he wrote. The text deeply touched a small group of readers who began sending messages. One woman said, "This story made me reconcile with my mother." Another reader commented, "Now I understand my father." Michael knew he was on the right track. Deep down, he knew it was also a way to continue his grandmother's legacy. She planted seeds. He watered them. And who knows, maybe one day he would reap the rewards. Not fame, but healing. Emotional, familial, spiritual healing. Because the truth, when delivered with love, can heal even wounds that seemed eternal. At the same time, he discreetly collaborated with the police. The investigation continued, but respectfully. The evidence was being catalogued, and the case was moving toward an official conclusion. John Walker's body was found and buried with dignity. His family was notified, an estranged daughter who never received answers. Michael wrote her a letter. He told her everything, honestly. He asked for forgiveness, even though he wasn't directly responsible. He explained the context, and he said he prayed for her to find peace. The reply came weeks later. Short but powerful: "Thank you for your honesty. The truth hurts, but silence hurts more." He cried as he read it. The Walker family's grief also needed to be honored. And it was there that Michael made his most important decision. He proposed to the city that they transform the old barn into a memorial of reconciliation. A place where people could pray, reflect, and begin anew. Not to celebrate mistakes, but to remember that every mistake can be redeemed. The idea was accepted. The community rallied. Volunteers renovated the space, adding benches, flowers, and a wooden plaque with a verse, "The truth will set you free." The barn, once the site of a secret, was now an altar of hope. And Michael felt at peace for the first time. The decision to transform pain into purpose changed his life. He began visiting recovery homes, nursing homes, and community centers. He told his grandmother's story, not with shame, but with honor. He didn't hide his mistakes, but extolled forgiveness. It was as if every word Margaret said still guided him through the corridors of life. In her old Bible, she found a note she'd never noticed before. It said, "If one day you fall, don't be afraid to look up. Because God's hand never leaves those who want to get up." It was like a message directly to that moment. Her faith still breathed between the lines of everything. Michael felt he needed to do more. He created a project named after his grandmother, Notebooks of Hope. He donated floral notebooks, just like hers, to at-risk youth. Each notebook came with a letter he'd written, inspired by the words he'd once received. It was a way to multiply what Margaret had done. The impact was beyond expectations. Soon, the project reached dozens of cities. Teachers, counselors, pastors, everyone wanted the notebooks. But the most moving part was the feedback. Young people said, "No one has ever written anything like this to me. Now I believe God hasn't forgotten me. I'll try again." Michael knew then that his mission wasn't to erase the past. It was to illuminate the path with the light of truth. A light his grandmother had lit in secret, but which now shone for many. The pain of his family's history still lingered, but had been reframed. He made the right choice. The difficult choice. The choice few have the courage to make. In an interview with a local radio station, he was asked, "Aren't you ashamed of your family?" The answer was simple, no. Because where there is true repentance, there is redemption. And I've seen that with my own eyes. The host remained silent. Then he simply said, "Thank you for that answer." Later that year, Michael was invited to speak at a conference on reconciliation. He took the stage with his notebook in hand. He told everything, not as a tragedy, but as a miracle. The miracle of a broken heart being healed, of a mistake being used by God as a testimony of restoration. Before leaving the stage, he left the audience with a question: if you discovered a secret that would change everything, would you hide it or use it to heal? The silence that followed was the greatest proof that that question planted a seed. And that was all he wanted. To plant seeds, just like his grandmother had. Margaret knew her time was running out. The days no longer had the same rhythm. Her memory faltered here and there, and her body, once active, now craved more breaks. But her spirit, it remained steadfast. Because there was something she still needed to do. Something she had been secretly planning for years. In the last week before Michael's birthday, she wrote another letter. It wasn't to him. It was to someone she'd never had the courage to reach out to, John Walker's daughter. Yes, the same one who never got answers about her missing father. Margaret felt that, before she left, she needed to give this woman what no one else had given her, the truth. The letter was long, handwritten, with firm, emotional handwriting. She told everything. She left nothing out. But the most surprising thing wasn't the content. It was the request. Margaret didn't ask for forgiveness for herself. She asked for forgiveness on behalf of her husband. And on behalf of a time when fear spoke louder than faith. She mailed the letter, with no return address. Just a verse on the back of the envelope: "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." Matthew 5 verse 7. And in that silent, courageous gesture, she revealed the last part of the secret. He gave Walker's daughter what time and the system never could, an answer. But Margaret would do more. The night before the party, before giving the notebook to Michael, she left an envelope in a pastor's mailbox. He was the local church leader, respected and discreet. Inside the envelope was a copy of the audio tape. She didn't want it all to die with her. She wanted the truth to be protected. And also, guided wisely. In her note to the pastor, she wrote, "If this young man ever comes to you seeking advice, welcome him. He will have many questions. And perhaps he needs a listening ear more than answers. God will use his story. But first, he needs to understand that he doesn't carry guilt. He carries a mission." And with that, she sealed her role. On the morning of her birthday, Margaret got up earlier than usual. She put on her best dress, carefully arranged her hair, and put on perfume. Not out of vanity, but out of respect for the moment. She knew that day wouldn't just be the delivery of a gift. It was the delivery of a mission, a key, a destiny. As I waited for the taxi, I clutched the notebook tightly. I had no doubt. I had no regrets. There were tears in my eyes, yes, but they were tears of peace. Because everything that needed to be said had now been said. The seed had been planted. And the rest was between God and Michael. At the party, she remained silent. She didn't explain the gift. She didn't force attention. She simply handed it over. And when she saw her grandson's awkward smile, she felt exactly what she expected. He wouldn't understand yet. But she trusted. She trusted like she had when she held Michael in her arms for the first time and prayed for his future life. Her faith was stronger than time. What no one knew was that same week, Margaret had signed the papers bequeathing her home to a local foundation supporting orphans. In his will, he requested that the house be used as a temporary shelter for at-risk children. "May this home continue to be a refuge, even without me in it," he wrote. It was this final gesture that Michael would only discover months later, when he received the letter from the registry office. Upon reading its contents, he fell to his knees. The childhood home would now be a home of hope for other children. Margaret's legacy went beyond the notebook, the story, and the confessions. It was a legacy of practical love. A love that transforms. Amidst so much pain, she chose to love. She chose to act. Even with past mistakes, she decided that her end would be a new beginning for others. And that gesture was what most impacted Michael. Because it showed that true repentance isn't satisfied with words. It translates into actions. The letter from the registry office was accompanied by a video she recorded days before her death. It was simple, filmed with the help of a neighbor. Margaret looked directly into the camera, her eyes sweet and steady. "If you're seeing this, it's because the cycle has closed. But love, it never ends. Use what you've learned. And keep going." She smiled at the end of the video. A calm, light smile, as if she'd finally given up everything. Michael watched in silence, tears streaming down his face. It was as if she was still there, holding his hand. And, in a way, she was. Because people like Margaret never truly leave. They become a part of us. Later, when visiting the house converted into a shelter, Michael took one of the notebooks from the Notebooks of Hope project. He left it in the master bedroom, along with a plaque, "A woman who believed in second chances lived here." The shelter coordinator was moved. She said the children already felt different there. As if the place truly welcomed them. It was at that moment that Michael understood the true power of history. His grandmother's final gesture wasn't just the confession of a secret. It was the liberation of lives. The beginning of a chain of healings. A legacy that would span generations. Because Margaret's silent love wasn't limited to her family. It reached many. And would reach many more. The following months were like a quiet unfolding of the seed Margaret planted. No major headlines, no public scandals. Just gentle waves of transformation. Michael continued with his project, but now with a new name, Legacy of Light. And it wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about the future. People began to seek him out. Ordinary people, with similar stories. Grandparents with secrets. Children with sorrows. Grandchildren with doubts. Each conversation brought something new, yet so familiar. As if everyone carried within themselves a part of that story. Because deep down, everyone has something that needs redemption. The barn became a symbol. Not of death, but of reconciliation. Couples visited the place to make vows. Families went to pray, cry, and give thanks. Some left letters on the wooden floor, as if pouring their souls out on an altar of secrets. And Michael went there, from time to time, just to read and pray for each one. Walker's daughter, who had received Margaret's letter, showed up unannounced one day. She knocked on the door of the shelter that had been her grandmother's home. Michael recognized her immediately. She didn't say much. She simply walked in, looked around, and left a small wooden cross on the living room floor. "My father deserves rest. And your grandmother deserves peace." That was confirmation that everything done, even with pain, had a purpose. Forgiveness isn't magical, it isn't immediate, it doesn't erase the past. But it paves the way. A path for light to enter where before there was only shadow. Michael wrote this down in a new notebook, the first he would write for himself, after all. On the cover, she drew a tree. On the trunk, the name, Margaret. And on each branch, the names of people impacted by the story. A living memorial, made of paper. Just as she did. Just as she wanted. Because what began as a simple gift was now an entire forest of stories, faith, and reconciliation. At church, Michael began participating in the counseling ministry. He never presented himself as an expert. He simply said, "I can listen to you. And I can pray with you." That's what Margaret did. What she taught without words. Because sometimes the greatest act of love is being present. Without rushing. Without judgment. Just being. The pastor who received the cassette envelope hugged him one day and said, "Your grandmother was a missionary without a pulpit. And now you are too." Michael smiled. He didn't want a stage. Or applause. He just wanted to continue planting what she planted. Because now he understood that this was the true legacy, multiplying the love received. One of the most memorable moments was when a young mother, a former drug addict, read the story online and decided to ask for help. Upon receiving a notebook with a letter written by Michael, she called in tears and said, "I thought God had forgotten me. But your grandmother reminded me that he still sees." Her voice echoed for days. Michael knew the road would still be long. That not everyone would understand. That there would still be criticism, doubts, perhaps even persecution. But now, he was steadfast. Because the faith he inherited was stronger than his fear. He knew he didn't need all the answers. He just needed to keep walking. The family's story became a small book. Not for sale, but for donation. Titled The Notebook of Truth, he left copies in libraries, churches, and schools. Each copy with a different inscription. Each with a silent prayer written on the back cover. Because Margaret taught, words have life. Use them purposefully. Little by little, Michael rebuilt his image of his grandfather. Not as a villain, nor as a hero, but as a real man. Who made mistakes. Who tried to make things right. Who loved deeply. And who was forgiven, even without asking. This forgiveness was the hardest inheritance to receive, but also the most liberating of all. On the following birthday, Michael sat in the same chair where Margaret used to sew. He lit a candle and wrote her a final letter. "Grandma, today I understand everything. Thank you for not sparing me the truth. Thank you for loving me enough to trust me. Your mission is now mine, and I will carry on." The candle burned down to the end, illuminating the notebook on the table. Outside, the rain fell lightly. But inside, his heart was at peace. Because he knew Margaret was seeing everything. And she smiled. Not with pride, but with relief. The cycle was completing. And the light, at last, was winning. Maybe you've never received a strange gift from someone you love. Maybe no one has ever handed you a notebook filled with difficult truths. But all of us, at some point in our lives, receive something we don't quite know how to handle. Sometimes it's a memory. Sometimes it's silence. And sometimes it's a calling. Margaret and Michael's story shows us that the truth can hurt, but it's always the path to healing. Because when we have the courage to face the past with faith and compassion, we open space for God to transform pain into purpose. It's not about erasing mistakes, but about allowing Him to use even our greatest stumbles for something greater. And now, the question remains, what would you do if you discovered a secret like that? Would you have the courage to reveal? To forgive? To use pain as a tool for reconstruction? Or would you hide in silence, hoping that time would bury everything? The answer can say a lot about who you are, but it can also reveal who you are becoming. Have you ever felt like you're carrying a weight that isn't just yours? Have you ever looked at someone in your family with questions you never had the courage to ask? Have you ever wondered if it's too late to start over? If so, maybe this story came to you for a reason. And maybe the notebook you need to open is closer than you think. Before you leave, I invite you to reflect. What would you leave written if you knew there was only one last letter left to deliver? Who would you like to forgive or ask for forgiveness from? And, most importantly, Have you reconciled with your own heart? If this story touched your heart in any way, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. This helps us continue bringing real stories, full of faith, reflection, and humanity, to more people. And more than that, it helps us form a community where truth liberates, but love rebuilds. Write here in the comments. Have you ever experienced something similar? What would you have done in Michael's place? And what did you learn from Margaret? I read each comment with care. And together, we can continue writing new chapters of hope, forgiveness, and new beginnings.